The bruise on Ophelia Crawford's cheek had faded to a sickly yellow, but the fear in her eyes remained as vivid as the day her husband had given it to her 3 weeks ago in San Andreas, California, during the scorching summer of 1878. She stood at the general store counter, counting out coins with trembling fingers while the proprietor wrapped her flour and sugar, and she could feel the weight of pitying stares from the other women shopping that afternoon. Everyone in this dusty mining town knew what Malcolm Crawford was, knew the sounds that came from their small house on the edge of town when he'd been drinking, knew that Ophelia had long ago stopped being the bright-eyed girl who'd arrived here as a mail-order bride 5 years earlier. She kept her gaze down as she gathered her parcels, murmuring her thanks in a voice so small it barely carried across the counter. The walk home felt longer every day, her feet dragging through the dirt streets as she passed the saloon where Malcolm would already be halfway through a bottle, the blacksmith shop where the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil reminded her of sounds she'd rather forget, the modest church where she'd stopped praying months ago because God had clearly stopped listening. The California sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat dampened the collar of her faded calico dress as she shifted the heavy basket from one hip to the other. Malcolm had been a different man in his letters, or perhaps she'd simply been desperate enough to believe the carefully crafted lies. At 19, orphaned and alone in Boston with no prospects and winter coming, the promise of a new life in California had seemed like salvation. She'd imagined golden sunsets and a kind husband and maybe children someday, a real home after years of bouncing between relatives who saw her as a burden. Instead, she'd found a bitter man 15 years her senior who drank away his mine wages and took out every disappointment on the woman he'd paid good money to bring west. She was nearly to the house when she heard the commotion near the livery stable. A crowd had gathered, and through the press of bodies, she could see a man struggling with a massive bay stallion that was rearing and striking out with its front hooves. The horse's eyes rolled white with terror, foam flecking its mouth, and the man trying to control it was cursing and yanking hard on the lead rope, which only seemed to make the animal more frantic. "That horse is going to kill someone," a woman near Ophelia muttered. "Been nothing but trouble since Garrett brought it in. Should just put a bullet in it." Ophelia found herself unable to look away from the stallion's wild eyes, seeing something in them she recognized too well. The horse wasn't mean, she realized. It was terrified. It was lashing out because it expected pain, expected cruelty, had learned that the only way to survive was to fight. Let him go. The voice was calm and deep, cutting through the noise with an authority that didn't need volume. The crowd parted, and Ophelia saw a tall man stepping forward, his sun-darkened face shadowed by the brim of a worn Stetson. He moved with an easy confidence, his long legs closing the distance to the struggling horse and handler in a few strides. "Stay back, mister," the handler warned. "This beast is dangerous." "The beast is scared," the stranger replied, still in that same even tone. "And you are making it worse. Let him go." Something in his voice made the handler comply, dropping the rope and backing away quickly. The stallion immediately bolted several steps back, snorting and tossing its head, ready to run or fight. The stranger didn't approach. He simply stood there, hands loose at his sides, and waited. Ophelia watched, forgetting for a moment her aching arms and her dread of going home. The man didn't move closer, didn't reach out, didn't make any demands of the terrified animal. He just stood, patient and still, and began talking in a low murmur too quiet for the crowd to hear. Minutes passed. The stallion's sides heaved, but its hooves stopped striking the ground. Its ears, which had been pinned flat against its skull, began to flicker forward, then back, then forward again. "I'll be damned," someone in the crowd whispered. The stranger took a single small step forward, then stopped. More murmuring, more waiting. Another step. The stallion tensed but didn't bolt. The man kept talking, kept moving at that slow, patient pace, until finally he was close enough to reach out. Even then, he didn't grab. He let his hand hover near the horse's neck, an invitation rather than a demand. When the stallion's muzzle finally stretched forward to investigate, the man's hand moved to stroke the sweating neck in long, gentle motions. "There you are," Ophelia heard him say. "There you are. Nobody's going to hurt you." The basket slipped from her grip, hitting the ground with a muted thud. Several people glanced her way, but she barely noticed, too transfixed by the scene before her. The stallion's head was lowering, its entire body starting to lose that rigid tension, and all because someone had shown it patience instead of force, gentleness instead of cruelty. Tears stung her eyes, and she didn't fully understand why. She bent quickly to retrieve her spilled groceries, her face burning with embarrassment, and when she straightened, she found herself looking directly at the stranger. He'd glanced over at the sound, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. His were the color of aged whiskey, warm and perceptive, and in that instant, Ophelia had the unsettling feeling that he could see right through her careful mask to the broken thing beneath. Then someone called out a question about the horse, and the moment passed. Ophelia hurried away, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She tried to push the image of the stranger from her mind as she reached the sagging porch of her house and steeled herself to go inside, but something about his patience, his gentleness, had lodged itself in her chest like a splinter she couldn't extract. Malcolm was passed out at the table when she entered, which meant she had a few hours of peace. She put away the groceries with practiced silence, started preparing supper, and tried not to think about kind eyes and gentle hands. That world wasn't for her. She'd made her choice when she'd signed the marriage contract, and there was no undoing it. In 1878 California, a woman didn't just leave her husband, especially not when she had nowhere to go and no means to support herself. But that night, as Malcolm woke and found fault with everything from the temperature of his food to the way she set the table, as his hand crashed across her face hard enough to make her ears ring and her vision blur, she thought of the stallion's wild eyes and the stranger's patient voice, and she wondered what it would be like to be treated with such gentleness. The next morning, Malcolm left before dawn to work his claim in the hills, which meant Ophelia had the day to herself. Her cheek throbbed where he'd struck her, and she could feel the swelling even without looking in the small mirror they owned. She went about her chores mechanically, hauling water from the well, tending the small vegetable garden that struggled in the California heat, mending a tear in one of Malcolm's shirts. She was hanging laundry when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to see the stranger from yesterday riding past on the bay stallion. The horse moved calmly beneath him, responsive to the lightest touch of rain, completely transformed from the wild creature of the day before. The man tipped his hat to her as he passed, and Ophelia found herself lifting a hand in a small wave before she could think better of it. He stopped his horse. "Morning, madam. Hope I didn't startle you." "No, I just—" She gestured vaguely at the horse. "Yesterday that animal was half mad." "How did you do that?" He dismounted with fluid grace, leading the stallion closer but keeping a respectful distance from her fence. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a face that was handsome in a weathered, honest way. Patience, mostly. An understanding that fear makes creatures do things they wouldn't normally do. Once he learned I wasn't going to hurt him, he settled right down. "I've never seen anything like it," Ophelia said softly. "I'm Kieran Xavier," he said, pushing his hat back slightly. "I bought the old Henderson Ranch about 10 miles north of town. Came to San Andreas to stock up on supplies and saw this fellow being mistreated. Couldn't walk away from that. So you bought him." "For more than he's worth, according to the man who owned him, but I'd say I got the better end of that deal." He patted the stallion's neck affectionately. He just needed someone to see past the fear to what he could be. Ophelia's throat tightened. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and turned back to her laundry. She could feel Kieran's gaze on her, could sense him noticing the fresh bruise, but he had the grace not to comment on it. "If you ever need anything, madam, the Henderson place isn't far. I know it can be lonely out here for folks." His voice was casual, but something in it made her glance back. There was no judgment in his expression, no pity, just a simple offer of kindness from one human being to another. "Thank you," she managed. "That's very kind." He tipped his hat again and rode away, and Ophelia stood clutching a damp sheet to her chest, watching until he disappeared around the bend in the road. She'd lived in San Andreas for 5 years, and couldn't name a single person she'd call a friend. Had become so isolated in her misery that some days she felt more ghost than woman. The simple act of having someone speak to her with respect, with courtesy, made her chest ache with a longing she'd tried so hard to bury. Over the following weeks, she saw Kieran several more times in town. He always tipped his hat, always offered a polite greeting, but he never pushed for more conversation than she seemed comfortable giving. She learned from the gossip at the general store that he'd worked cattle drives for years, saving his money, and had finally bought his own place. He was a hard worker, people said, kept to himself mostly, but was always willing to lend a hand when needed. The widow Thompson mentioned that he'd fixed her broken fence without being asked, and Mary Chen from the restaurant said he was unfailingly polite and tipped well. Ophelia found herself thinking about him more than she should, found herself looking for him when she went to town, found herself disappointed on the days she didn't see him. It was foolish and dangerous, and she tried to crush the feelings before they could take root, but they persisted despite her best efforts. He represented everything Malcolm wasn't, everything she'd given up hoping for, and that made him both irresistible and terrifying. Malcolm noticed her distraction one evening in late August and didn't like it. "You've been uppity lately," he said, his words slurring together. He'd been drinking since he got home, as he did most days now. The mine was playing out, his earnings dwindling, and his temper grew shorter as his prospects darkened. "Think you're too good for me now?" "No, Malcolm, I don't think that," she said quickly, trying to placate him. But she'd learned over the years that sometimes there was nothing she could say or do to prevent what came next. His fist caught her in the ribs, driving the air from her lungs. She fell against the table, gasping, and he grabbed her hair, yanking her head back. "You remember who you belong to," he snarled, his breath hot and sour against her face. "You remember what you are, nothing but a bought woman, and a poor bargain at that." The beating that followed was worse than usual, and when it was finally over, when Malcolm had drunk himself into unconsciousness, Ophelia lay curled on the floor of their bedroom, every breath a sharp agony, and knew she couldn't endure much more of this. Something inside her that had bent and bent under the weight of his cruelty was finally approaching its breaking point. She thought of the stallion's wild eyes, thought of Kieran's patient voice, and she wept into the rough floorboards until she had no tears left. She could barely move the next morning. Her ribs screamed with every breath, and she was certain at least one was broken. Malcolm was already gone when she woke, which was a mercy. She managed to dress herself, though the effort left her shaking and nauseous, and she knew she needed help. The doctor was out of the question. Malcolm would never forgive the expense or the public acknowledgement of what he'd done. She had no friends to turn to, no family. She was utterly alone, except she wasn't, not quite. The thought came unbidden, and with it, a spark of something that might have been hope or might have been desperation. The Henderson Ranch. Kieran had said it was only 10 miles north. If she could make it there, if she could just get that far, maybe he could help. Maybe he would turn her away, but maybe, just maybe, he would show her the same patience and kindness he'd shown a frightened horse. The decision made, she moved with painful slowness to gather a few essentials. She couldn't take much, just what would fit in a small bundle. She took the $20 she'd been hiding in a tin at the back of the cupboard, money she'd saved a nickel and dime at a time from the household allowance Malcolm gave her. She took a change of clothes, a hairbrush, and the locket that had belonged to her mother. Everything else would have to stay. The walk was agony. Each step sent jolts of pain through her injured ribs, and the late summer heat pressed down on her like a physical weight. She had to rest frequently, leaning against fence posts and trees, fighting waves of dizziness and nausea. More than once, she considered turning back, but the thought of returning to that house, to Malcolm, was worse than any physical pain she was currently enduring. It took her nearly 4 hours to cover the 10 miles, and by the time she saw the Henderson Ranch in the distance, her vision was blurring at the edges, and her legs were barely supporting her weight. The ranch was modest but well-maintained, with a sturdy barn, several corrals, and a small house that looked like it had been recently repaired. She could see cattle grazing in the distance and several horses in the nearest corral. She made it to the front porch before her legs finally gave out. She collapsed against the railing, unable to go any further, and had just enough strength to call out before darkness swept over her. She woke to the sensation of gentle hands examining her ribs and cool water being pressed to her lips. Her eyes fluttered open to find Kieran's face above hers, creased with concern, and she realized she was lying on a bed inside a small, clean room. Panic seized her, and she tried to sit up, but his hand on her shoulder stopped her. "Easy now," he said in that same calm voice he'd used with the stallion. "You've got at least 1 broken rib, maybe 2, and you're severely dehydrated. You need to stay still." "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't know where else to go. I shouldn't have come here." Malcolm will be so angry. Something flickered in Kieran's eyes, something dark and dangerous, but his voice remained gentle. "You're safe here, Ophelia. That's all that matters right now." He'd used her first name, and she wondered dimly how he knew it, but then she remembered that everyone in San Andreas knew everyone else's business. "I can't stay," she said, even though every fiber of her being wanted nothing more than to sink into the softness of this bed and never move again. "When he finds out I'm gone, he'll come looking. He'll make trouble for you." "Let him," Kieran said, and there was steel beneath the gentle words. "You're not going back there. You don't understand. I'm his wife. I don't have any choice. There's always a choice." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the ranch. "I grew up watching my father beat my mother, watched her spirit break a little more each day until there was nothing left of the woman she'd been. When I was 15, I came home to find her dead, and he told everyone she'd fallen down the stairs, and everyone believed him because that's what people do. They look away, they make excuses, they let it happen." He turned back to face her, and the pain in his eyes was raw and real. "I swore then that if I ever had the chance to help someone in that situation, I would. So you can stay here as long as you need, and if Malcolm Crawford comes looking for you, he'll have to go through me." Ophelia stared at him, unable to speak. No one had ever stood up for her, had ever offered her protection without expecting something in return. "Why?" she finally whispered. "Why would you do this for me? "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because I saw something in your eyes that day at the livery. The same thing I saw in that stallion. A spirit that's been beaten down but not quite broken. And I believe that with time and patience, spirits can heal, just like bodies." She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that healing was possible, but 5 years of cruelty had taught her to expect the worst from everyone. Still, as she lay in his clean bed in his quiet house, with his gentle concern surrounding her like a blanket, she felt the first fragile tendril of hope beginning to unfurl in her chest. Kieran proved to be a man of his word. Over the following days, he tended to her injuries with a competence that spoke of experience, wrapping her ribs tightly, bringing her food and water, checking on her frequently without being intrusive. He gave her the bedroom and took a bedroll in the main room, never once making her feel uncomfortable or unsafe. He asked nothing of her, expected nothing, just provided a quiet space for her body to begin healing. On the third day, she felt strong enough to get up and move around. She found Kieran outside working with a young sorrel mare in the round pen, using the same patient techniques she'd seen him employ with the bay stallion. She stood at the fence and watched, marveling at his gentleness, at the way he seemed to understand what the horse needed before the animal knew itself. He noticed her after a few minutes and walked over, wiping sweat from his brow. "You should be resting." "I've been resting for 3 days. I feel like I should be doing something to earn my keep." "You don't owe me anything, Ophelia." "I know, but I want to help, please. I can't just sit idle while you work." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, if you're feeling up to it, the kitchen could use a woman's touch. I'm not much of a cook, and I'll admit the place has gotten a bit neglected since I've been on my own." It felt good to have a purpose, to move through the sunny kitchen preparing a meal, to clean and organize and make the space feel more like a home. Her ribs still ached, but the pain was manageable, and the simple act of doing something useful lifted her spirits in a way she hadn't expected. She found herself humming as she worked, a habit she'd lost years ago, and the sound of her own voice surprised her. When she called Kieran in for supper that evening, the look on his face when he saw the spread she'd prepared made all the effort worthwhile. "I can't remember the last time someone cooked for me," he said, and there was such genuine appreciation in his voice that she felt her cheeks warm. They ate together at the simple wooden table, and for the first time in years, Ophelia experienced what it was like to share a meal without fear. There was no tension, no walking on eggshells, no dread of saying the wrong thing. Kieran asked her about Boston, about her life before she came west, and he actually listened to her answers, asked follow-up questions, seemed genuinely interested in her as a person rather than just a possession. "I always wanted to see the ocean," he said at one point. "I've spent my whole life in landlocked territories, and I can't imagine what it must be like to stand on a beach and see nothing but water stretching to the horizon." "It's beautiful," Ophelia said, remembering the rare times her aunt had taken her to the shore as a child. "Cold, though. The Atlantic isn't like the warm waters I've heard they have down south. But there's something about the sound of the waves, the smell of salt air, that gets into your bones." "Maybe someday I'll see it," he said, and then added, "Maybe we both will when you're healed and have figured out what you want to do next." The casual way he included her in his future plans, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, made her chest tighten. She wasn't used to being considered, being included, being treated as someone whose wants and needs mattered. A week passed, then 2. Malcolm never came looking for her, which both relieved and troubled her. She'd expected him to tear through San Andreas demanding her return, but the silence from town was absolute. Kieran made a trip in for supplies, and reported that Malcolm had told people she'd gone back east to care for a sick relative, a lie that would buy him time and save face. It made Ophelia angry, the ease with which he could simply explain away her absence, but it also meant she was temporarily safe. During those weeks, she found herself falling into a routine that felt almost domestic. She took over the cooking and cleaning, tended a small vegetable garden Kieran started for her, even helped with some of the lighter ranch work. Her ribs healed slowly, the bruises faded, and she began to put on a little weight as regular. Adequate meals became the norm rather than the exception. She felt stronger than she had in years, both physically and emotionally. But more than the physical healing, she found herself slowly learning to trust again. Kieran never raised his voice, never made sudden movements that might startle her, never touched her without permission. When he needed to show her how to do something, he asked first. When she flinched at loud noises or unexpected sounds, he didn't mock her or grow impatient. He simply gave her space and time to recover. One evening in late September, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the California hills in shades of gold and crimson. The air had finally started to cool with the approach of autumn, and there was a pleasant breeze that rustled the leaves of the oak tree near the house. Ophelia had been quiet for a while, wrestling with thoughts that had been building for days. "Kieran," she finally said, her voice tentative, "why haven't you ever married?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I suppose I never found the right woman. Or maybe I was never in one place long enough. The cattle drive life doesn't lend itself well to relationships. And after what I saw growing up, I promised myself I'd never take a wife unless I was absolutely certain I could be the kind of husband she deserved." "What kind is that?" "The kind who treats her as an equal, who respects her thoughts and opinions, who understands that being married doesn't mean owning another person." He glanced at her, and in the fading light, his eyes were very dark. "The kind who would rather die than raise a hand to her in anger." Ophelia's breath caught. "I think any woman would be lucky to have you." "I'm not sure about that," he said with a small smile. "I'm no prize. I work too hard, I'm set in my ways, and I'm not getting any younger at 28. But I do know how to treat people with kindness, and I think that counts for something." "It counts for everything," she whispered. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. Ophelia realized with a start that somewhere over the past few weeks, her feelings for Kieran had shifted from gratitude to something deeper, something that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She was falling in love with him, had perhaps been falling since the moment she'd watched him gentle that frightened stallion with nothing but patience and kindness. But she was still married, still legally bound to Malcolm, and until that changed, any feelings she had for Kieran were impossible and improper. The thought crushed her, the unfairness of it, the cruelty of finding someone who could make her happy when she was trapped in a situation that seemed to have no escape. As if sensing her thoughts, Kieran said quietly, "There are ways to end a marriage, Ophelia. It's not easy and it's not quick, but it can be done. If you wanted to pursue that, I could help you find a lawyer, help you with the costs. Malcolm would never agree to a divorce, and the courts wouldn't grant me one just because he's cruel. That's not grounds, not in California, not unless I can prove adultery or abandonment or something equally serious. He beats you. That's as serious as it gets. But it's my word against his, and I'm just a woman. Who's going to believe me?" Kieran was quiet, and she could see the frustration in the set of his shoulders, the clench of his jaw. They both knew she was right. The law in 1878 was not kind to women seeking to leave their husbands, especially not when those husbands were white men with property, however meager. The deck was stacked against her in every possible way. "Then we'll find another way," Kieran said finally. "I don't know what it is yet, but we'll find it. You're not going back to him, Ophelia. I won't let that happen." She wanted to believe him, wanted to have his faith that things could work out. But years of disappointment had made her wary of hope. Still, sitting there with him in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night, she allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it would be like if things were different, if she were free. If she could stay here, could build a life with a man who treated her with kindness and respect. The fantasy was so sweet it hurt. October arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints of rain. Ophelia had been at the ranch for nearly 2 months, and the transformation in her was remarkable. She smiled more easily now, laughed at Kieran's dry humor, moved through the world without the constant expectation of pain. She'd let her guard down in increments, and each time Kieran proved himself trustworthy, proved that not all men were like Malcolm, she healed a little more. They'd fallen into an easy companionship that felt natural and right. They worked together during the day, ate meals together, spent evenings talking about everything and nothing. Kieran told her stories about his years on cattle drives, about the places he'd seen and the people he'd met. She told him about her childhood, about the mother she barely remembered and the father who died when she was 10, leaving her at the mercy of reluctant relatives who'd made it clear she was a burden. "Is that why you answered Malcolm's advertisement?" Kieran asked one evening. They were in the barn, and he was teaching her how to properly groom a horse. His hands guided hers, showing her the right pressure to use with the curry comb, and she tried to ignore the way her skin tingled at his touch. "I was 19 and desperate," she said. "My aunt made it clear I needed to find a husband or find employment, and there weren't many opportunities for women like me. I couldn't afford training to be a teacher or a nurse. I wasn't skilled enough to work as a seamstress." Malcolm's letters were so kind, so full of promise, and I wanted to believe that someone could want me, that I could matter to someone. "You matter," Kieran said quietly, and his hand stilled over hers. "You matter very much, Ophelia." She turned to look at him, found his face very close to hers, and the air between them suddenly felt charged with possibility. She could see the want in his eyes, could feel it echoed in her own racing heart, but he didn't close the distance. He gave her the choice, the same way he gave the horses a choice, and she loved him even more for it. But she also knew they couldn't cross that line, not yet, not while she was still legally another man's wife. So she stepped back and saw understanding and disappointment flicker across his features before he masked them. "I should get supper started," she said, her voice not quite steady. "Ophelia." She paused at the barn door, looking back. "When you're free, whenever that is, however long it takes, I'll wait. I want you to know that." Tears blurred her vision. "You shouldn't make promises like that. You don't know how long it could be. You don't know if it will even be possible." "I know that what I feel for you is worth waiting for," he said simply. "I know that you're the first woman I've ever wanted to build a life with, and I know that I'm not going anywhere." She fled to the house before she could do something foolish like cross the barn and kiss him, like tell him she felt the same way, like promise him things she had no right to promise. But his words echoed in her mind as she prepared their meal, as they ate in companionable silence, as she lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling. He would wait for her. He cared for her. He wanted a future with her. It should have been the happiest thought in the world, but instead it filled her with a desperate fear. Because she knew that happiness like that didn't come to women like her. She'd learned long ago that hope was dangerous, that wanting things only led to disappointment and pain. And yet here was Kieran, offering her everything she'd ever dreamed of, and she was terrified of reaching for it because she couldn't bear to have it snatched away. The first rain came in mid-October, a steady drizzle that turned the dusty ranch roads to mud and brought a fresh coolness to the air. Ophelia stood at the kitchen window watching Kieran work with the horses in the corral, oblivious to the weather, and she felt a surge of affection so strong it stole her breath. She tried to keep her feelings contained, had tried to maintain some emotional distance, but it was impossible. She loved him. She loved his patience, his kindness, his quiet strength. She loved the way he treated every living creature with respect, the way he listened when she spoke, the way he looked at her like she was someone precious. She was still standing at the window when she saw the rider approaching. Her heart stopped when she recognized Malcolm's stocky form on his old roan gelding. He was coming up the drive at a steady pace, his hat pulled low against the rain, and panic seized her so completely that for a moment she couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Then Kieran saw him too. She watched him say something to the horse he'd been working with, watched him give it a final pat before walking to meet Malcolm at the edge of the yard. She couldn't hear their words over the sound of rain on the roof, but she could see the tension in both men's postures, could see Malcolm gesturing angrily while Kieran stood his ground, calm and immovable. She forced herself to move, to go outside onto the porch, because whatever was about to happen, she needed to face it. She wouldn't hide while Kieran dealt with her problems. "There you are," Malcolm called when he saw her, his voice thick with false joviality that didn't hide the anger beneath. "Been looking all over for you, wife. Time to come home now. This charade has gone on long enough." "She's not going anywhere with you," Kieran said, his voice level but firm. "That's not your decision to make, friend. She's my wife, and what happens between a man and his wife is nobody else's business." Malcolm dismounted, clearly intending to come up to the porch, but Kieran moved to block his path. "It becomes my business when a man beats a woman half to death and sends her running into the wilderness. It becomes my business when she shows up at my door with broken ribs and bruises covering half her body. And it becomes my business when I decide to offer her sanctuary from a monster who doesn't deserve to call himself a man." Malcolm's face flushed dark red. "You watch your mouth. You don't know anything about our marriage. I know enough." Kieran's voice had gone cold as winter ice. "I know she's not going back with you. I know that if you ever lay a hand on her again, you'll answer to me. And I know that you need to get off my property right now before I forget myself." "You're holding my wife against her will," Malcolm sputtered. "That's kidnapping. I could have you arrested." "Then do it," Kieran said. "Go to the sheriff. Tell him you want your wife back, and while you're at it, why don't you explain to him why she ran away in the first place? Why don't you show him the broken furniture in your house from the nights you got drunk and violent? Why don't you ask your neighbors if they've ever heard a woman screaming in the middle of the night?" Malcolm's hand dropped to his gun, and Ophelia's heart leaped into her throat. But Kieran didn't move, didn't even flinch, and something in his absolute calm seemed to give Malcolm pause. The older man's hand hovered near his weapon for a long moment before dropping back to his side. "This isn't over," Malcolm said, but there was less certainty in his voice now. "She's my wife, and she'll come back eventually. Where else does she have to go? She has a home here for as long as she wants it," Kieran said. "Now get off my land." Malcolm mounted his horse, his movements jerky with barely suppressed rage. He looked past Kieran to where Ophelia stood on the porch, and the hatred in his eyes made her stomach clench. "You'll regret this, Ophelia. You think he's different, but he's not. All men are the same in the end, and when he tires of you, when he's taken what he wants and tossed you aside, you'll have nothing. No home, no reputation, nothing. You'll be ruined, and you'll have no one to blame but yourself." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, mud flying from the gelding's hooves. Kieran stood watching until he disappeared around the bend, then turned and came up onto the porch. Ophelia was shaking so hard she had to grip the railing to stay upright. "He's right," she whispered. "I'm ruining your reputation being here without a chaperone. People will talk. They probably already are talking." "Let them talk," Kieran said. He reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement, and when she didn't pull away, he took her hands in his. They were work rough and warm, and they steadied her like an anchor. "I don't care what people say, Ophelia. I care that you're safe. That's all that matters." "But he could make trouble for you. He could tell the sheriff lies, could say you kidnapped me or worse." "The sheriff is a reasonable man, and more than one person in San Andreas knows what Malcolm is. I'm not worried about him, but I am worried about you." His thumbs brushed over her knuckles, a feather-light touch that sent warmth flooding through her. "You're pale as milk and you're shaking. Come inside, sit down. I'll make you some tea." She let him lead her inside, let him settle her into a chair by the stove, let him busy himself with the kettle and teacups. The domesticity of it, the care in his movements, made her want to cry. How had she found this man? How had she gotten so impossibly lucky, and how long could it possibly last? "He's not going to give up," she said as Kieran set a steaming cup in front of her. "He'll find some way to force me back. He won't let me go, not because he loves me or wants me, but because I'm his property and he doesn't like losing what's his." "Then we need to make sure you're not his property anymore," Kieran said. He sat down across from her, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about this, and I know a lawyer in Sacramento. Good man, helped me with the property purchase for this ranch. I could write to him, see what our options are. There has to be some way to legally dissolve your marriage. That takes money I don't have, and time we might not have. Malcolm could come back with the sheriff, could have me dragged back by force. Not if we prove he's dangerous, not if we get enough people willing to testify to his cruelty." Kieran leaned forward, his eyes intent on hers. "You're not alone in this, Ophelia. I know you're used to fighting your battles by yourself, used to having no one in your corner, but that's changed. I'm here, and I'm going to do everything in my power to help you get free of him. I promise you that." She wanted to believe him, but the hope was so fragile, so easily crushed. "Why?" She asked again, the same question she'd asked weeks ago. "Why do you care so much? Why are you willing to risk so much for me?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Because I'm in love with you, Ophelia. I've been falling in love with you since the day you stood in that crowd watching me gentle that horse, and I saw the same broken spirit in your eyes that I saw in his. I've watched you heal over these past weeks, watched you come back to life like a flower after rain, and it's been the greatest privilege of my life to be part of that. So that's why I care. That's why I'm willing to fight for you, to risk anything for you. Because you matter to me more than anything else in this world." The tears she'd been holding back spilled over, tracking hot down her cheeks. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've tried not to, tried to keep my heart closed off because I was so afraid, but I can't help it. You've been so kind to me, so patient, and you make me feel like I'm worth something, like I matter, like I could have a real future instead of just surviving day to day." Kieran stood and came around the table, and when he held out his hand, she took it. He pulled her gently to her feet, and then his arms were around her, careful of her still healing ribs, and she was crying into his chest while he held her and murmured soft reassurances into her hair. It was the first time he'd held her like this, the first time she'd allowed herself to be held, and the tenderness of it broke something open inside her that had been locked away for years. "We'll figure this out," he said. "I don't know how yet, but we will. And then, if you'll have me, I'd like to make you my wife." The right way, with a real wedding and a real marriage based on love and respect. I want to grow old with you, Ophelia. I want to build a life with you here on this ranch, raise children with you if you want them, wake up next to you every morning and know that I'm the luckiest man alive. She pulled back just enough to look up at him, to see the sincerity shining in his eyes. I want that too, she said. I want it so much it scares me. Then let's make it happen. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. Let's fight for it together. She nodded, and when he lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, she rose on her toes to meet him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle and sweet, a promise more than a passion, and it tasted like hope and new beginnings. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Ophelia felt like a different person than the broken woman who'd collapsed on this porch 2 months ago. She felt strong. She felt brave. She felt, for the first time in 5 years, like she might actually have a future worth living. Kieran wrote to his lawyer friend in Sacramento the next day, laying out the situation and asking for advice. The response came 3 weeks later, and the news was better than they dared hope. California law did allow for divorce on the grounds of extreme cruelty, but Ophelia would need witnesses willing to testify to Malcolm's abuse, and she would need to file the petition herself in court. The process could take months, possibly over a year, but it was possible. The challenge was finding witnesses. Most people in San Andreas subscribed to the belief that what happened between a man and his wife was private business, and few would be willing to speak publicly against Malcolm, regardless of what they might have seen or heard. Ophelia had been so isolated during her marriage that she couldn't think of anyone who would stand up for her, but Kieran was nothing if not resourceful. He spent several days riding into town, talking to people, and slowly he began to build a case. The doctor who'd treated Ophelia twice for suspicious injuries was willing to provide records and testimony. The woman who lived in the house next to Malcolm's admitted, reluctantly, that she'd heard screaming on multiple occasions. The bartender at the saloon confirmed that Malcolm was a mean drunk who'd been thrown out more than once for starting fights. Even the minister, who'd counseled the couple early in their marriage, agreed to testify that he'd had concerns about Malcolm's temper. It wasn't much, but it was something, and with the lawyer's help, they filed the petition in November of 1878. Malcolm was served with the papers, and according to reports, he flew into a rage that resulted in him being detained overnight by the sheriff. That worked in their favor, as it demonstrated his violent tendencies to the court. The waiting was agonizing. Ophelia threw herself into work around the ranch, needing to stay busy to keep from dwelling on all the things that could go wrong. Kieran was endlessly patient with her moods, which swung wildly between hope and despair, never pressuring her, always offering quiet support. Winter came to California, bringing more rain and cooler temperatures. The ranch work changed with the season, and Ophelia found she had a knack for animal husbandry. She helped Kieran with the horses, learning to read their moods and body language, and discovered that the same patience he showed them could be learned and practiced. There was something deeply satisfying about earning an animal's trust, about seeing a frightened creature relax under her hands. Christmas came and went quietly. Kieran surprised her with a new dress he'd ordered from Sacramento, a beautiful blue calico that fit her perfectly, and she'd knitted him a warm scarf and gloves for his winter riding. They exchanged gifts on Christmas morning in front of the fire, and the simple domesticity of it filled Ophelia with such contentment that she almost forgot the legal battle still hanging over their heads. The court date was set for late February, and as it approached, Ophelia's anxiety grew. She would have to face Malcolm in court, would have to speak publicly about the abuse she'd endured, would have to lay bare her shame and pain for strangers to judge. The thought of it made her physically ill, but Kieran stayed by her side through it all, reminding her that she was strong, that she could do this, that he believed in her. The day of the hearing arrived cold and clear. They rode into Sacramento together, a journey of several days, and stayed in a modest hotel near the courthouse. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Thomas Bradley, met with them the night before to prepare Ophelia for what to expect. He was confident they had a strong case, but he cautioned that juries could be unpredictable when it came to domestic matters. Walking into that courtroom was one of the hardest things Ophelia had ever done. Malcolm sat on the opposite side with his own lawyer, and the hatred in his eyes when he looked at her was palpable. But Kieran was right behind her, and when she faltered, his hand at the small of her back steadied her. The hearing itself was brutal. She had to recount in detail the abuse she'd suffered, had to describe the beatings, the degradation, the constant fear. Malcolm's lawyer tried to paint her as a disloyal wife who'd abandoned her husband for another man, tried to suggest that any injuries she'd sustained had been accidents or exaggerations. But the witnesses held firm, and the doctor's testimony about her broken ribs and other injuries was particularly damning. When it was Malcolm's turn to speak, he tried to play the victim, claiming Ophelia had been unstable and difficult, that he'd done his best with an ungrateful wife. But his performance was undermined by his obvious anger, the way his hands clenched into fists when he spoke about her, the barely controlled violence in his voice. The judge, a stern man in his 60s, listened to everything with an impassive expression. When all the testimony was complete, he announced he would review the evidence and issue his decision within 30 days. It meant more waiting, but Bradley seemed optimistic as they left the courthouse. "I've seen this judge rule on domestic matters before," he told them. "He's more progressive than most when it comes to women's rights. I think he'll grant the divorce." The ride back to the ranch felt interminable. Ophelia was exhausted, emotionally and physically wrung out from the ordeal, and she spent much of the journey leaning against Kieran's shoulder, grateful for his solid presence. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. Their understanding had gone beyond words. The decision came on March 15th, delivered by post. Ophelia's hands shook so badly as she held the envelope that Kieran had to open it for her. He read it first, and the smile that broke across his face told her everything she needed to know even before he read the words aloud. Divorce granted on the grounds of extreme cruelty. The court finds that Malcolm Crawford inflicted sustained physical and emotional abuse upon his wife, Ophelia Crawford, and that the marriage is hereby dissolved. Mrs. Crawford is awarded her freedom and is under no further obligation to her former husband. Ophelia burst into tears, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, they were tears of joy. She was free. After 5 years of hell, after months of legal battles, after so much fear and pain and uncertainty, she was finally, truly free. Kieran swept her into his arms, spinning her around in the kitchen while she laughed and cried at the same time. When he set her down, his eyes were suspiciously bright as well. "You did it," he said. "You're free, Ophelia, you're free." "We did it," she corrected. "I never could have done this without you. So now what?" He asked, though the hope in his voice suggested he already knew what he wanted the answer to be. "Now," she said, "if your offer still stands, I'd very much like to become your wife. The real way, like you said, with love and respect and a real marriage." His answer was to kiss her, deep and thorough and full of promise, and when they finally broke apart, both breathless and grinning, he said, How about we get married right here on the ranch? Small ceremony, just us and a few friends, nothing fancy. I don't need fancy, Ophelia. I just need you. They were married on the first day of April in 1879, in front of the same barn where Ophelia had first watched Kieran Gentle, a frightened horse. The minister from San Andreas performed the ceremony, and a handful of people who'd supported them through the legal battle attended as witnesses. Ophelia wore her blue calico dress and carried wildflowers that Kieran had picked that morning. The sun shone warm on her face as she stood beside the man who'd saved her, who'd shown her that love could be gentle and kind, who'd helped her heal when she'd thought she was too broken to ever be whole again. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, when Kieran kissed her as the small gathering applauded, Ophelia felt a completeness she'd never known was possible. She was no longer Ophelia Crawford, the beaten wife of a cruel man. She was Ophelia Xavier, wife of a good man, and the future stretched before her bright with possibility. Their wedding night was tender and patient, with Kieran taking his time to ease the fears that still lingered from her previous marriage, showing her that intimacy could be beautiful rather than brutal. He worshipped her body with gentle hands and soft words, erasing the memories of pain and replacing them with pleasure. They came together as equals, as partners, as two people who'd chosen each other freely and completely. Life on the ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. Ophelia took over more of the horse training, discovering she had a real talent for it. She worked particularly well with mares and younger horses, her patience and soft approach perfect for building trust. Kieran handled the cattle and the heavier ranch work, but they made all decisions together, true partners in every sense of the word. The first year of their marriage was one of the happiest of Ophelia's life. She learned what it meant to live without fear, to go through each day knowing that the man she loved would never hurt her, would always respect her, would always treat her as someone valuable and cherished. The shadows that had haunted her eyes gradually faded, replaced by laughter and light. She gained weight, her curves filling out in a healthy way, and color returned to her cheeks. People who'd known her during her marriage to Malcolm commented on how different she looked, how alive she seemed, and she took pride in showing them that healing was possible. In the spring of 1880, Ophelia discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with joy but also trepidation. She'd never considered children during her marriage to Malcolm, had been secretly grateful that she'd never conceived because she couldn't imagine bringing a child into that hellish household. But now, with Kieran, she wanted it desperately. She wanted to create life with him, wanted to raise children in a home filled with love and laughter. Kieran was over the moon when she told him, though she could see the worry in his eyes too. "Are you scared?" he asked as they sat together on the porch, his hand resting protectively over her still flat belly. "Terrified," she admitted, "but also happier than I ever thought possible. I want this, Kieran. I want to have your child to build a family with you." "You're going to be an amazing mother," he said softly. "You have so much love to give and you're so patient and kind. Our child is going to be so lucky to have you." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Kieran doted on her, taking over more of the physical ranch work and insisting she rest frequently. Ophelia felt wonderful, energized and glowing, and she spent her days preparing the small second bedroom to be a nursery. She sewed baby clothes, knitted blankets, and imagined the life they would give their child. A life free from violence, free from fear. A life filled with love. Their son was born on a cold December morning in 1880, arriving quickly after a relatively easy labor. Kieran was there through it all, holding Ophelia's hand and murmuring encouragement, and when the midwife placed the squalling infant in his arms, The look of pure wonder on his face made Ophelia's heart swell. "He's perfect," Kieran breathed, staring down at the tiny red face. "Ophelia, he's absolutely perfect." They named him James, after Kieran's father despite the man's flaws, because Kieran said he wanted to give the name to someone who would honor it. Baby James had his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes, and he was the most beautiful thing Ophelia had ever seen. She held him against her chest and wept with the sheer, overwhelming love she felt, with the knowledge that she'd helped create this perfect little person, with the gratitude that she'd lived long enough to experience this joy. Motherhood transformed Ophelia in ways she hadn't expected. She discovered depths of strength and patience she hadn't known she possessed, found that caring for this tiny vulnerable being brought out protective instincts that made her fierce. She nursed him, rocked him through colicky nights, sang him lullabies her own mother had once sung to her. And through it all, Kieran was there, a devoted father who changed diapers and walked the floor with a fussy baby and gazed at his wife and son like they'd hung the moon. James grew into a happy, healthy toddler who loved the ranch animals and followed his father everywhere. By the time he was 2, he could sit on a horse in front of Kieran, his little hands gripping the saddle horn, squealing with delight as they rode around the property. He was fearless and curious, and watching Kieran's patience with him, the gentle way he taught and guided, filled Ophelia with so much love she sometimes felt like her heart couldn't contain it all. In the spring of 1883, Ophelia found herself pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the first, with more sickness and fatigue, but she was still happy. Their daughter arrived in November, a tiny thing with wispy blonde hair and a lusty cry that announced her presence to the world. They named her Clara, after Ophelia's mother, and she was as different from her brother as night from day. Where James was bold and adventurous, Clara was cautious and thoughtful, watching the world with solemn eyes that seemed to take in everything. Life with 2 small children kept them busy, but the Xavier Ranch prospered. Their reputation for training quality horses grew, and people came from all over California to buy horses they'd gentled. They expanded the house, adding on more rooms and a proper porch that wrapped around 3 sides. They planted fruit trees and expanded the garden, and slowly the ranch became not just a place to live but a real home, filled with love and laughter and the sound of children playing. Years passed in a blur of seasons. James grew tall and lean like his father, developing the same easy way with animals, the same quiet strength. Clara grew into a thoughtful young girl who loved reading and drawing, who could gentle even the most skittish foal with her patient approach. They added a 3rd child in 1886, another boy they named Thomas, and he became the family comedian, always making them laugh with his antics and observations. Through it all, Ophelia and Kieran's love only deepened. They never took each other for granted, never forgot how lucky they were to have found one another. Every night, they took a few minutes to sit together on the porch, holding hands and watching the sun set over their land, grateful for every single day they'd been given. Ophelia sometimes thought about those dark years with Malcolm, but they felt like they'd happened to a different person, in a different lifetime. That broken, frightened woman bore little resemblance to the confident, happy mother and wife she'd become. Kieran had been right all those years ago when he'd said that spirits could heal with time and patience. He'd mended hers piece by piece, day by day, until she'd become whole again. On a warm evening in May of 1890, Ophelia and Kieran celebrated 12 years of marriage. Their children were in bed, and they sat on the porch swing they'd installed the previous summer, gently rocking and watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. James was now 9, Clara 6, and Thomas 3, and the house still rang with their noise and energy even after bedtime. "Do you ever regret it?" Ophelia asked, her head resting on Kieran's shoulder. Taking in a broken woman and all the trouble that came with her, Kieran's arm tightened around her. "Not for a single second. You were never broken, Ophelia. You were wounded, and there's a difference. Something broken can't be fixed, but wounds heal. You just needed time and someone to believe in you while you healed." "You saved my life," she said softly. "No," he corrected. "You saved your own life when you walked away from Malcolm. I just gave you a safe place to land. Everything else, all the healing and growing and becoming who you are now, that was all you." She turned to look at him, this man who'd shown her what love really meant, who'd taught her that she deserved kindness and respect, who'd given her a life beyond anything she'd dreamed possible. His hair was starting to show threads of silver at the temples now, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. But to her, he was as handsome as the day she'd first seen him gentling that frightened stallion. "I love you," she said. "I'll never stop loving you, Kieran Xavier." "And I'll never stop loving you," he replied, then kissed her softly. "Forever and always, Ophelia. You and me and the life we've built together. That's everything I'll ever need." As they sat there in the peaceful evening, surrounded by the life they'd created, Ophelia sent up a silent prayer of thanks. Thanks for the courage to leave. Thanks for finding Kieran. Thanks for every day of happiness she'd been given. She thought of that frightened woman who'd collapsed on this very porch 12 years ago, thought of how far she'd come, and she smiled. That woman would be proud of who she'd become. That woman would be amazed at the life she now lived. The ranch continued to thrive over the years. By the mid-1890s, the Xavier name was well known throughout California for quality horses trained with patience and respect rather than force. James, now a young man of 15, worked alongside his father, showing the same natural talent with animals. He'd already started talking about taking over the ranch someday, about building on what his parents had created. Clara at 12 showed more interest in the business side of things, keeping meticulous records of sales and expenses, her sharp mind perfectly suited to managing accounts. Young Thomas at 9 was still figuring out where his interests lay, but he showed promise with carpentry and had already built several improvements around the property. Ophelia watched her children grow with pride and wonder. She'd done her best to raise them with the values Kieran had shown her: kindness, patience, respect for all living things, and the understanding that true strength came from gentleness rather than force. She taught them by example that healing was possible, that the past didn't have to define you, that love could transform everything. In the spring of 1896, word reached them that Malcolm Crawford had died. He'd been found alone in his decrepit house, having drunk himself to death slowly over the years. Ophelia felt a complex mix of emotions at the news. There was relief that he could never threaten her again, sadness at the waste of a human life, and a strange sort of gratitude that his cruelty had inadvertently led her to Kieran, and the life she now cherished. "Are you all right?" Kieran asked that evening as they prepared for bed. "I think so," she said honestly. "I can't say I mourn him, but I also can't forget that if I'd never married him, I wouldn't have ended up here. I wouldn't have found you. I wouldn't have this life. So in a strange way, even the terrible things led me to where I was meant to be." Kieran pulled her close, understanding in his embrace. "That's a generous way to look at it, but I'm glad you're here, no matter the path that brought you. Every day with you is a gift." As the century drew to a close, the Xavier family had become pillars of the San Andreas community. They were known for their generosity, often helping neighbors in need, donating to the church and school, providing horses at reduced prices for families who couldn't afford full price. Ophelia, in particular, had become an advocate for women in difficult marriages, quietly offering support and resources to those who needed help leaving dangerous situations. She turned her pain into purpose, determined that other women wouldn't suffer as she had if there was anything she could do to help. The new century arrived with celebration and hope. On January 1st, 1900, the Xavier family gathered on their porch to watch the sunrise on a new era. James was now 19 and courting a sweet girl from town named Elizabeth. Clara, at 16, was already helping manage the ranch's finances and talking about becoming a teacher. Thomas, at 13, had decided he wanted to be a veterinarian, fascinated by animal health and care. They were good children, Ophelia thought, looking at them gathered together. They'd grown up in a home filled with love, had never known violence or fear, and they carried themselves with a confidence she'd never had at their ages. "What are you thinking about?" Kieran asked, his arm around her waist as they watched the sun paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "How blessed we are," she said. "How far we've come. That frightened woman who showed up here 22 years ago would never believe this is where she'd end up." "That frightened woman was always this strong," Kieran said. "She just needed the chance to prove it to herself." Over the next several years, they watched their children launch into their own lives. James married Elizabeth in 1901 and built a house on the far side of the property, taking over more of the day-to-day ranch operations as Kieran began to slow down. Clara did become a teacher, working at the San Andreas schoolhouse and making a real difference in young lives. Thomas left for veterinary school in San Francisco, determined to bring modern animal medicine back to their rural community. Ophelia and Kieran found themselves becoming grandparents. James and Elizabeth had 3 children in quick succession, and suddenly the ranch was filled with the sound of young voices again. Ophelia loved being a grandmother, loved spoiling her grandchildren, and then sending them home to their parents. She and Kieran had more time for each other now, more time for quiet mornings over coffee and long evening walks around the property they'd built together. On their 25th wedding anniversary, in April of 1904, Kieran surprised Ophelia with a trip to Boston. "I remember you telling me about the ocean," he said. "About standing on the beach and watching the waves. I want to see it with you. I want to share that with you." They took the Transcontinental Railroad, a journey that would have been impossible when they first met, but was now routine in the new century. Ophelia showed Kieran the city where she'd grown up, the streets she'd walked as a lonely, orphaned girl, the beach where she'd dreamed of a better life. Standing on that sand with her hand in his, watching the Atlantic waves crash against the shore just as they had 30 years earlier, she felt the circle complete. That frightened girl had gotten everything she'd dreamed of and more. She'd found love, found safety, found purpose. She'd healed. "Thank you," she said to Kieran as they stood there with salt spray on their faces and gulls crying overhead. "For what? For seeing me when I was invisible. For believing I was worth saving when I'd stopped believing it myself. For loving me with such patience and kindness that I learned to love myself again. For giving me a life beyond anything I could have imagined." Kieran turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. At 54, he had more silver than dark in his hair, and his face was weathered by years of outdoor work, but his eyes were the same warm, whiskey color that had first captured her attention. "Ophelia, loving you has been the greatest honor of my life. Watching you heal, watching you become the strong, confident woman you are, watching you be an amazing mother and now grandmother, it's been a privilege I'll never take for granted. You saved me as much as I saved you. I was just going through the motions before you came into my life. You gave me purpose, gave me a family, gave me reasons to build something lasting. So thank you, my love, for choosing to stay, for choosing to heal, for choosing to build this life with me." They kissed there on the beach. Two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built something beautiful from broken pieces, who'd proven that love and patience could overcome even the deepest wounds. Around them, the waves continued their eternal rhythm, constant and enduring like the love they shared. They returned to California and their ranch, to their children and grandchildren, to the life they'd built over a quarter-century. The years continued to pass, marked by birthdays and holidays and the everyday rhythms of ranch life. They faced challenges, of course, drought years and lean times, the occasional injury or illness, but they faced everything together, their bond only strengthening with time. In the summer of 1910, Ophelia turned 55 and Kieran turned 60. They were grandparents to 7 grandchildren now, with an 8th on the way. The ranch was thriving under James's management. Clara's teaching had impacted dozens of young lives, and Thomas had returned to establish a veterinary practice that served the entire region. The Xavier name was synonymous with integrity and quality throughout California. On a warm evening in late August, Ophelia and Kieran sat on their porch swing, watching the sun set as they'd done thousands of times over 31 years of marriage. The day had been spent at a family gathering, celebrating Thomas's 30th birthday, and the house was finally quiet again after hours of noise and laughter. "Tired?" Kieran asked, his arm around her shoulders. "A good tired," she said. "The kind that comes from a day well spent with people you love." "Do you remember the first time we sat out here together?" he asked. "You were so frightened, so broken-hearted. I wasn't sure you'd ever smile again." "I remember thinking you were either the kindest man I'd ever met or completely insane for taking me in," Ophelia said with a laugh. "Probably a bit of both." "Definitely both," he agreed, chuckling. "But I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. Every single moment, good and bad, because they all led us here." Ophelia looked out over their land, at the barn where she'd first seen him gentle that stallion, at the corrals where they'd trained hundreds of horses over the years, at the house they'd expanded and improved and filled with love. She thought about the woman she'd been, about how thoroughly she'd been broken by years of cruelty, and about the man who'd patiently, carefully, lovingly helped her heal. "I used to think broken things could never be whole again," she said softly. "But you taught me that isn't true. You taught me that with patience and kindness, anything can heal. Anyone can heal. You saw value in me when I couldn't see it in myself, and you never gave up on me, even when I'd given up on myself. You were always worth it," Kieran said simply. "Always." They sat together as darkness fell, surrounded by the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night, the chorus of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through the trees they'd planted decades ago. Inside the house, photographs chronicled their life together, faces smiling out from frames, children and grandchildren, moments captured and preserved. A life well lived, a love well earned. "I love you, Kieran Xavier," Ophelia said, as she'd said thousands of times over the years. "Today, tomorrow, and forever." "And I love you, Ophelia Xavier," he replied, kissing her forehead. "My brave, beautiful wife. You're the best thing that ever happened to me." As the stars began to emerge overhead, they remained there together. Two souls who'd found each other in the wilderness of life, who'd built something beautiful from broken pieces, who'd proven that love really could heal all wounds. The scared woman who'd collapsed on this porch 32 years ago was gone, replaced by someone strong and whole and happy. The patient cowboy who'd taken her in had become a devoted husband, father, and grandfather, his kindness rippling out through generations. Their love story wasn't the easiest or the simplest, but it was real and true and lasting. It was proof that sometimes the greatest loves come from the deepest pain, that healing is always possible, and that patience and kindness are the most powerful forces in the world. In the Wild West of 1878, in a small town in California, two broken spirits had found each other and become whole. And that wholeness had created a legacy of love that would endure for generations to come. A testament to the transformative power of treating another human being with the dignity, respect, and tenderness they deserve. The Xavier Ranch continued long after Ophelia and Kieran were gone, their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carrying on the traditions they'd established, treating animals and people alike with the patience and kindness that had been their hallmark. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the California hills in shades of gold and crimson, those who knew the story would sometimes pause and remember the cowboy who'd seen a broken spirit and mended it with nothing but patience and love, and the woman who'd been brave enough to accept that gift and transform it into something beautiful. Their story became legend in San Andreas, passed down through generations as a reminder that no one is beyond healing, that kindness matters, and that true love isn't about grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It's about showing up every day, about choosing gentleness over force, about having the patience to let someone heal at their own pace. It's about seeing value in another person, even when they can't see it in themselves, and never giving up on them no matter how long the journey takes. And so the years turned into decades and the decades into a new century. But the love story of Kieran and Ophelia Xavier remained, eternal as the California hills, constant as the stars overhead, a beacon of hope for anyone who'd ever been broken and wondered if they could ever be whole again. The answer their lives proved was always yes. With patience, with kindness, with love, healing was always possible. Always.